I met Emma when we were both in our 20s. She worked as a waitress in a cafe near the college, and I often went there with friends after lectures. She was witty, beautiful, and had an infectious laugh. We fell in love so quickly that it seemed to be written in the stars. A quick wedding, a small apartment, shared dreams. Everything seemed so perfect. I was working as an accountant, spending long hours at work, dreaming of the day when we could afford a big house. And Emma always supported me despite the hard times. Or at least it seemed that way. The first alarm bells went off when she started working for a large company as a personal assistant. Her boss, Josh, seemed like an ordinary middle-aged man. But then something started to change. Emma became distant. She always had her phone with her, and when it rang, she would go into another room. For our 10th wedding, I organized a surprise. I bought out her favorite restaurant, invited her closest friends, even hired musicians to play the same tune that sounded on the day of our first dance. She seemed happy, but her gaze often stopped somewhere in the distance, as if she was somewhere outside of this moment. A few days after the holiday, I noticed something that changed everything. There was an open email on her laptop, which she had left at home. It was nothing special, just a generic thanks for the great time from Josh. But the phrase that ended the email spurred me into action. I can't wait for the next time we can be alone. My heart sank. Something seemed to have fallen into a deep chasm in my soul. I did what anyone in my position would do. I tried to track down more. Gradually, the truth began to emerge. Her business trips coincided with events that Josh was also going to. I hired a private investigator to confirm my suspicions. The detective didn't have to wait long for the results. Photos, meeting places, and hotel reservations all confirmed that Emma and Josh were more than just colleagues. But the worst was yet to come. I was overwhelmed by a feeling of emptiness. Not anger, not rage, but emptiness. I looked at those photos, at the documents that confirmed every one of my worst suspicions, and I felt as if someone had ripped out a part of me. But I had to act in cold blood. I decided not to make a scandal right away. Instead, I gathered more evidence. I needed to find out how far this had gone and why. A few weeks passed, and I noticed that Emma was becoming more cautious. She started to use her phone less often in front of me, deleting all her messages. This only confirmed my suspicions. I began to analyze her behavior. How she came home later, how her smile became forced, how her touch lost its warmth. One evening, I asked her a simple question. How is work? How's Josh? Emma froze for just a moment, but it was enough for me to realize that she was hiding something. It's okay, she said, turning back to her plate. That little scene was a signal. She knew I was suspicious, but she didn't realize how deeply. A few days later, the detective sent me the final report. Contained more than I expected. It turned out that Josh had a habit of using his official position to manipulate his subordinates. The company had already had several scandals that were strangely hushed up. But the real kicker came when I found emails that had been accidentally synchronized with a cloud service. Josh had promised Emma he would help her get a promotion if she would cooperate with him outside of work. In the emails, she was hesitant at first and then seemed to give in. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was manipulation, psychological control that Josh skillfully applied to her. but I decided not to be silent. I began to prepare a plan that would not only help expose Emma, but also bring Josh to justice. My first task was to find a way to get the truth out to the people involved. I gathered all the evidence. Photos, correspondence, even recordings of conversations that I was able to get thanks to the detective. When everything was ready, I decided to arrange a meeting with Emma. The next night, I invited her to dinner at our favorite restaurant. She looked a little surprised, but agreed. We were sitting at a table, and I could see her hands nervously fidgeting with her napkin. "I want to talk about us," I began, and her eyes instantly darted to mine. She nodded without saying a word. I carefully pulled the envelope out of my bag and put it on the table. "This is all I know." Her face turned pale as soon as she saw the photos. "It's not what you think," she began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Emma, I know everything, and you know I'm not going to let this ruin my life. But I want to hear the truth from you." She broke down. Tears rolled down her face, and she told everything. About how Josh had used his status, how she had fallen into a trap from which she could not escape. She apologized, but it didn't matter to me anymore. The last step was to expose Josh. I anonymously sent all the evidence I had collected to his bosses and his wife. A week later, he was fired and the company launched an internal investigation. As for Emma, our marriage did not survive this test. We divorced. She returned to her parents, and I started a new life, free from lies and manipulation. But it wasn't all her fault. I also realized that maybe if I had paid more attention to our marriage, things could have turned out differently. But now everything is over. Sometimes the truth can be cruel, but it is better to live with it than in the shadow of a lie. I tried to stay strong. After the divorce, I started to rebuild my life. It would seem that there is nothing complicated in this. Just erase the person who betrayed you from your life. But it wasn't. The imprints of memories remained everywhere. In the places we visited together, in the habits I subconsciously adopted, in the little things that were connected to her. I sold the house we lived in and moved to another city. It was necessary. A new beginning, new acquaintances, and a new me. One day, while scrolling through the news on my phone, I came across an article. The title caught my eye, and I clicked on the link. It was a story about Josh. It turned out that after he was fired, he tried to get a few other jobs, but his reputation was ruined after the scandal. His wife filed for divorce, taking the children and most of the property. It should have brought me pleasure, but in fact I felt only emptiness. Later, I found out that Emma got a job at a small charity organization. She started from scratch again, just like me. Our mutual friends said that she had changed a lot, but I didn't bother to check these words. My life began to stabilize. I met new people, made friends, and even started thinking about giving love another chance. But the experience I went through left me with a deep scar. Now I see things differently. Trust is the most valuable thing that can exist between people. And when it is destroyed, it cannot be fully restored. One day, while walking in the park, I stopped at a bench where a couple was sitting. They were laughing, discussing something lively, and looked so happy. I caught myself thinking that I no longer feel pain when I look at others. Maybe it was a sign that I had finally let go of the past. Several years have passed. Life has taught me to appreciate the little things and not to dwell on what I cannot change. I built a career that brought me satisfaction and found peace in small pleasures. Walking, reading, traveling. Love, it no longer seemed out of reach. I met Julia in a bookstore where I was looking for a gift for a friend. She was there too, choosing a book. Our eyes met, and something elusive emerged between us. We started dating. She was sincere, sensitive, and had a great sense of humor. Her light gradually melted the ice that betrayal had left in me. One day we were sitting at home talking about the past. I decided to tell her my story without hiding anything. Julia listened attentively without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You are strong. What you went through could have broken many people. But you survived, became better, and are now ready for a new life." Her words touched the deepest strings in my soul. I realized that I could trust again. A few months later, I proposed to her and she accepted. Our wedding was modest but sincere. For the first time in many years, I felt real happiness. I didn't talk to Emma anymore, although I heard that she had also found someone and started a new chapter in her life. I did not hold a grudge against her. The past remained where it should be. Now I know that even the deepest wounds can heal if you give them time and open them up to the world again. Life always goes on, even after the darkest moments. Our life with Julia became peaceful and harmonious. I found in her the support I needed so much. She was my shield and my inspiration at the same time. I felt that I had finally found my person, the one I wanted to spend the rest of my days with. However, even after years, you can't get rid of all your demons. I realized this when one day, on my way home from work, I saw a familiar number on my phone screen. It was Emma. I didn't answer the call, but she didn't give up. She started leaving messages. "I know you don't want to talk to me anymore, but I needed to say it. I'm sorry, and I believe you need to know the truth." These words triggered a wave of memories in me. I didn't want to dive into old hurts, but what she said made me think. And then, a few days later, I called her back. "Hi, Emma. What's up? You won't believe this, but I made another mistake," she said in a quiet, hesitant voice. "You know, I was never ready for what happened. Now I realize how much it hurt you when I betrayed you. I'm really sorry. It was the same Emma I used to admire. She was always determined, even in the most difficult situations. But now her voice sounded quiet and sad. It was not what I wanted to hear. She hadn't changed, and she was still trying to come back to me. I can't change it," she continued, "but it hurts that you rejected me." I could not believe that she was trying to come back into my life again after everything that had happened. I could feel the confusion and anger overwhelming me. But there was no room for such conversations in my life anymore. I looked at Julia, who was sitting next to me and listening intently to what we were saying. Her eyes did not express anger or jealousy, only calmness. I put the phone on the table, looked at Julia, and answered, "It's over, Emma. I found my place, and you need to find yours too." And I ended the conversation. That night, when I lay down next to Julia, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't need the past or the old mornings that would bring new pains. I was living in the present with someone who was real to me. That was the moment when I finally let go. And since then, I have never looked back. I woke up the next morning with the feeling that I had finally made the right choice. Julia was there, still asleep, her face expressing peace and harmony. I felt safe next to her. It was exactly the peace I was looking for after everything that had happened. Over the next few weeks, I tried to rebuild our lives. We went for walks together, spent our evenings talking about everything that was bothering us, laughing, sharing our experiences. I felt like we were becoming one again. But one late-night message changed everything. It was from my friend, Benjamin. I hadn't responded to him in months because he had been part of the horrible situation that led to my cheating on Emma. But this time he was writing to share something important. I found out who was really your enemy when all this happened, and now you want to know the truth? I thought about it for a few minutes, weighing whether to dive into the old cases. Julia had already asked me several times if I could just leave it all behind. But the inner feeling that something was not yet complete did not let me rest. I answered, "Tell me." Benjamin responded immediately. "It wasn't just a betrayal, and you know it. You were part of a bigger plan, even if you didn't realize it. Your wife, Julia, she was really part of it all." I was amazed. I was speechless. At that moment, I felt my whole world start to fall apart again. It was her, Julia. That morning, when we discussed old events, I saw her perfect side, her warmth and support. But now I was learning that her hidden agenda was much darker than I could have imagined. "What do you mean?" I wrote, feeling my heart clench. "She worked for the same man you cheated with. She knew everything. She had her own plans." I read this and could not believe my eyes. Julia, who was my hope, my support, turned out to be part of a big game. The betrayal I had experienced was only part of a plan I could never have even imagined. My heart was beating faster. I knew I needed to see it with my own eyes. I couldn't just let it go. No matter how much I wanted to leave everything in the past, no matter how much I tried to move forward, these messages hung in my head, not giving me peace. It was a new betrayal, bigger, more complicated, and it was literally tearing me apart from the inside. I looked at Julia, who was still sleeping, her face as calm as ever. She didn't know that I had received the message, didn't know that I had learned the truth. But something in her behavior, in her eyes lately, made me doubt. Perhaps it was the same intuitive feeling I had when I began to suspect Emma. My subconscious was whispering to me that something was wrong with Julia. 2. I get out of bed and quietly leave the room so as not to wake her. My mind is working at full capacity. I had to check it out. I started looking for old documents, emails, any information that could confirm what Benjamin said. I opened my laptop and started checking joint projects, old messages, even mail. And lo and behold, I found something. One inconspicuous email that I hadn't paid attention to before. It was information about investors, about some meetings and tasks that Julia kept secret from me. I remembered that she always said how much work she had been doing lately, but never specified the details. My heart started beating faster, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just career planning or work assignments. It was something else. It looked like manipulation, deception. I began to feel my trust in Julia, which had grown over the years of our marriage, suddenly coming apart at the seams. I decided to go ahead, but before I could draw any conclusions, I needed to see her reaction. Maybe it was all just speculation. I decided to wait, but I couldn't stop these thoughts from running through my head. Suddenly, Julia left the room. Her face was calm, but there was something unusual in her eyes, something genuine. "Are you worried about something?" Her voice sounded so familiar, but I was no longer sure of everything I was seeing. All these years, all these moments, was it really true? Or was I just idealizing her? I looked up and met her eyes. Different emotions were fighting in my soul. I could not understand what to do. "Do you work for them?" I finally asked. Her face changed. At first she seemed shocked, but after a moment her gaze turned cold. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to hide the slight nervousness in her voice. "About Benjamin. About your role in all of this. I've seen it all." I saw her face turn pale. She stood in front of me as if she were frozen for a moment, and then slowly began to speak. And everything she said was even more shocking than I could have imagined. "I couldn't tell you. I didn't want you to know about it. But everything I did was for us. You know, I was working for them, but not to betray you. I was trying to make sure that you and I could start a new life without debts, without problems, without all this. I couldn't tell you that." I looked at her with considerable doubt. It was hard to accept, but there was sincerity in her words. She seemed to really believe in what she was saying, even though her actions were quite different. "I still can't believe it," I said quietly. "You played with my feelings, and now I don't know what to do." Julia took a few steps toward me, her hands dropping. "I know you're angry, and I can't change what I've done, but I'm ready to do everything I can to make it right. I love you. This was my biggest test, and I was ready to do anything for us." I stood there silently, weighing her words, but I could not forget everything that had happened before. It was different than I could have imagined. All these years together, all these hopes for a better future, turned out to be sand that crumbled because of mistrust. I looked at Julia, at her eyes, but I couldn't go back to what had happened. That trust no longer existed, and although what she said seemed true, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. We were standing in front of each other. I was ready to leave, but she still hoped she could fix everything. But for me, this breakup was inevitable. And yet, I took the last step back, promising myself that I would not return to this trap again. My soul was heavy with what I had just experienced. I felt my beliefs about trust and love crumble like sand through my fingers. Julia stood in front of me, her eyes filled with sadness and disappointment. Although she tried to assure me that everything that had happened was for the sake of our future together, I no longer believed her words. It all sounded like an attempt to justify the impossible. I turned around and started walking toward the exit, feeling like every step left me with less and less emotion. If I could turn back the clock, I wouldn't change a thing. But now I knew that the future was unpredictable, and I didn't belong here anymore. I couldn't stay in this house any longer, which had become a stranger, full of lies and manipulations. Caught up in my thoughts, I almost didn't hear her start to follow me. "You can't just leave." Her voice sounded too strong, too convincing. I looked back and saw her approaching me with her arms wrapped around me, trying to speak again. "You can leave me, but don't forget who I am to you." Her words were barely audible, but they didn't change my decision. There was no longer the warmth in her voice that I had once felt. Instead, I felt coldness, despair, and a desire to control the situation. "You can't control me anymore, Julia," I replied with absolute certainty. I was no longer afraid of her. I wasn't afraid to leave this house and move on. All I felt was a desire to change my life, to start over, without this heavy burden I had to carry all this time. Julia stood there, her face blurred with tears, but there was still the same cruelty in her eyes that made it impossible for her to understand that we were done. I could feel that she wanted to tell me something, but the words were not coming out. I turned around and left the house. With every step I took, I felt my shoulders getting lighter. I felt no regrets, no shame for leaving her. My thoughts were clear, my decision was final. It was not just a decision, it was a path to a new life. I was no longer part of this world of betrayal and secrets. I knew that even if I left everything behind, it would not be the end. I would never allow myself to fall into a trap like that again. So I walked without looking back, calmly and with determination. Julia stayed behind, and I went forward, into the unknown, ready for new challenges and opportunities. It was my freedom, and even if I didn't know where it would lead me, I was ready to go on. My freedom was priceless, and I felt like every step I took me further away from the pain I had experienced when I found out about her betrayal. It felt like I was waking up from a nightmare, but I didn't want to interfere with the past anymore. I couldn't change what happened, but I could change my future. I walked to my car, got in, and started driving. The city night was foggy, but I felt like everything in the world was fading away. The silence in the cabin was cut only by the sound of the engine, and I did not seek solace in music or conversation. This was my journey, my test. The next morning I found myself in another city. I rented a hotel room and decided that this time I would take my time. I still didn't know what I wanted from life, but I knew for sure that I wouldn't wait for permission from anyone to be happy. Julia no longer had power over me. I would no longer allow anyone to dictate terms to me, to set their own rules. Those few days of silence and reflection were exactly what I needed. I began to find peace in my thoughts, and although the pain didn't disappear immediately, I could feel it gradually receding. I found a new purpose, no longer losing myself for someone else. But life was not that simple. One evening, a few days after I left Julia, I received a message on my phone. The sender was her number. "I made a mistake. Maybe I still love you. You understand why this happened, right?" These words did not evoke any emotions in me. I read them several times, but I didn't feel any response. I just put the phone on the table and, looking at its screen, realized that everything she could say no longer mattered. She wanted me to understand her, but I had no desire to go back. And although her words echoed in my head, I knew that I would not return. The one who was ready to hurt me was no longer a part of my life. I felt free, and nothing else could change that feeling. That night I decided that I would never again allow any person to put me in a situation where I could not be myself. It was a new beginning. I had my freedom, and that was all I needed. Life would not stop challenging me, but I was no longer afraid. I knew that true strength was not in holding on to old ties, but in letting go and moving on. And although my heart was still closed to new people, I knew that one day I would find a place for happiness in it again. but not in the same way as before. For me, it was not just the end. It was a new beginning. I sat in silence, looking out the window of my hotel room, watching the night city reflected in the lights and lanterns. My heart was calm, but still in its depths, there was an echo of the events that had happened. My thoughts remained scattered, but I was not afraid, because I realized one important thing. I would no longer be manipulated. I would no longer allow others to play on my emotions. This was my war, and I was ready to win. A few days later, I returned to my hometown, determined to continue my life without looking back. However, things were not that simple. Even though I decided to leave everything behind, Julia never stopped reminding me of herself. She started looking for me, trying to reestablish contact, but I didn't respond. From time to time, I received her messages, some expressing regret, others trying to justify my behavior. Her words no longer had any effect on me. I was no longer the person I used to be. I had become stronger, more self-sufficient. But from time to time, I still allowed myself to think about why I had become such an important figure to her. I couldn't forget how many times I had devalued myself for her favor, how many times I had indulged in her manipulations and lies. There was no longer any room for regret or a desire to make things right. I was not someone who could afford to be hurt again. However, one day, unexpectedly, I met her. It happened by chance when I was in the store, and our meeting was an unpleasant surprise for both of us. She approached me, her gaze was wary, but in her eyes I saw the same sense of guilt that I had noticed before. She was different, changed, like me, but the pain of our separation had not disappeared. "Hi," she said, her voice quiet, but I could hear that she was trying to show her strength, even though she didn't believe in it. "Hello," I replied, looking at her coldly. Her eyes could not meet my gaze. She was embarrassed, but maybe he had no place in her life anymore. She took a step back, as if waiting for me to say something more. "I know that you no longer believe in my words. I know that nothing can bring you back," she said. I was silent. Julia's words became just an empty sound. They could no longer touch my heart. My emotions reverberated within me, but with each new look at her attempts at justification, I became more and more convinced that she no longer had any influence on me. We had become strangers. I felt that I had left her in the past, and this meeting only confirmed it. "It's over," I said, and those were the last words I said to her. She turned and left, leaving me standing in the store. I felt neither relief nor anger. I only felt that my soul was finally free of all the burdensome thoughts that connected me to her. At that moment I realized that I didn't even need her forgiveness or explanation. I was free of the burden, and now I was going my own way. It was a new beginning. I left the store feeling like a heavy shadow had disappeared from my soul. The air outside became fresher, and I took a deep breath, as if free of all the years that had left their mark on me. And although Julia was no longer a part of my life, I realized that everything that had happened was not just a painful experience, but also a great lesson. I returned to work, but with different convictions. I was no longer looking for approval from others, no longer trying to meet other people's expectations. I became more honest with myself. Gradually, my life began to recover, and I found new hobbies that filled me with energy. I started playing sports, spent more time with friends and family. I even started exploring new career opportunities. One day, a few months after that meeting, I was sitting in a cafe with a friend, discussing new prospects. Suddenly, I received a message from Julia. She didn't ask me for a refund or any compensation for my loss. No. Her message was simple and short. I understand you. I wish you happiness. I sat and looked at the phone screen for a long time. There was no anger or manipulation in her words, just a sense of acceptance. Perhaps she finally realized that we both had to move forward by letting go of each other. I answered succinctly, "Thank you, and all the best to you." It was the end of one important part of my life, and I could finally move on. There was no more room for pain and betrayal. Now I will keep only what brought me joy, real relationships, real moments of happiness. When I got home that evening, I looked at myself in the mirror. Although I looked almost the same, I was different inside. I had regained my strength, my independence. I was no longer dependent on what anyone else thought of me, and it was the best feeling in the world. Life goes on. After that evening, for several weeks I felt the heavy chains of betrayal and uncertainty gradually let go of me. I was returning to my normal life, but with new convictions and attitudes. What happened between me and Julia was not just a lesson, but a kind of revolution. I no longer aspired to ideals that did not exist, and I no longer tried to satisfy people who were not ready to give me the same in return. All these months of loneliness, reflection, and pain have led me to finally begin to appreciate myself. I found a hobby that I had long forgotten because of my constant relationships and responsibilities. I enrolled in a painting course, even though I always thought I was not good at holding a brush. I started spending more time with friends I hadn't paid attention to for a long time and with my family, who have become my biggest source of support. Day by day, I found new ways to express myself. I started to change my life, becoming more independent, less dependent on the opinions of others. My friends noticed the changes, and I felt my self-respect returning. But one evening, a few months after I last heard from Julia, I received her message again. It was unpredictable, but even more unpredictable was the content of her words. I realized that I wasn't honest with myself, and I realized that I will always love you. I accept my mistake, but I want to talk. Maybe we need to set the record straight to move forward. I sat there looking at the phone screen and didn't know how to react. She had asked for forgiveness, but it was no longer that important to me. The fact that she was back in my life again was outdated. I realized that I no longer wanted to participate in her dramas, in her attempts to shift the responsibility onto me. I answered briefly, not trying to delve into the past. We both made our mistakes, and now we need to go our separate ways. That was it. In the end, I realized that what I wanted most was to let go of the past and move forward without looking back. Cheating is not just the destruction of a relationship, it is a lesson for both parties. It taught me many things, but the most important thing is that I will not repeat my mistakes again. My strength lies in keeping only what gives me strength and letting go of everything else. I looked at my new perspective. I was no longer striving to prove my loyalty to someone who didn't value me. I was no longer striving to be someone I wasn't just to please someone else. In the end, the most important thing was for me to be honest with myself and realize what was important to me. Sometimes we stay in painful relationships for too long because we are afraid of change, but in the end, it is change that gives us the opportunity to grow. And I am ready to move forward. A few months passed and life became more stable. I could feel my inner self starting to revive again after all the emotional storms I had been through. I started a new job in another company where my abilities and experience were valued, and I even found time to relax, which was a real discovery for me. My circle of friends expanded, and I met new people with whom it was easy and pleasant to spend time. I wasn't lonely, but now it didn't feel like I was trying to run away from myself. I just became more confident in my desires and needs. But everything changed one ordinary Thursday. I was coming home from work and got a message on my phone. It was Julia. I was not expecting it. A lot of time had passed, and I thought we had left everything behind. I opened her message, and something inside me clenched. I'm trying to rebuild my life, and I think I've finally realized what's important. But I want to talk. It's not about us. It's about me. I know I've made a lot of mistakes, and I'm sorry. Her words did not surprise me, but at the same time I had the feeling that she was trying to manipulate the situation again. Her choices and her actions were not easy for me, and although I did not feel resentful, I could not allow myself to return to these emotional labyrinths again. I didn't respond to the message right away. I felt I needed some time to figure out what I wanted out of the situation. Maybe I still had some frustration left, but I was no longer ready to put myself in the forefront just because someone else demanded it. So I thought again about my life, about what really mattered to me. A day later, I decided to respond. I appreciate your words, but we already have our own separate reality. What happened between us cannot be fixed. We have to go our separate ways. I pressed the send button and felt myself letting go of all those experiences that had been holding me back. It was final. I was not going back. I know that she might want to give it another try, but I realized that it's not for me. I have really changed. I have become a person who no longer looks for reasons to forgive people at the expense of my own soul. I will no longer allow betrayal, even in the form of apologies and regrets, to undermine my ability to be myself. Let this be a lesson for both of us. Betrayal is not just a moment. It is a decision that has consequences. I understand that each of us had our own reasons, but now we have our own paths. And I move forward, leaving behind only what matters, and leaving the past where it belongs behind. After that, everything became a little calmer. I realized that it was important to leave the past behind, not to let it dictate my future. I was no longer the kind of person who waited for changes or hoped for something that had long gone. Now I focused on what was happening in my life right now, and that was the most important thing. I gradually adapted to my new life. I became more open in my relationships with people. I did not strive for perfect relationships, but I felt that they should be honest and mature. Mutual respect became the key for me. I dated different people for several months, but I was in no hurry to let someone back into my life completely. But one day I met her. She was nothing like Julia. Linda, my new friend, worked in marketing. She was self-sufficient, but at the same time, she was not emotional. She didn't demand anything too special from me, and I liked that. We didn't have any dramatic twists and turns like in my past. Our relationship was simple and seemingly easy. But I was already so careful after everything that happened that nothing could catch me. I was always on the alert, even if I didn't admit it to myself. Internally, I was ready for any changes, ready to move on, but with more caution. Everything was great with Linda at first. We went out often, laughed together, and just enjoyed our time. But deep down, I never let go of the caution that had become part of me after Julia's betrayal. I couldn't ignore her behavior on some of our dates. She was too inattentive to the little things, didn't always respond to messages, or didn't show as much interest as she used to. It seemed strange to me, and I started to have doubts. But then something happened that made me really wary. Once, after one of our evenings, I found a message in her bag that began like this: "You know this is just a game for us, right?" These words were a signal to me, and although I had already experienced betrayal once, I could not let it happen again in my life. I looked at Linda in a new way, and suddenly everything became clear. She was part of a game that I didn't want to experience again. This time I was ready to avoid repeating my mistakes. I didn't try to sort things out with her without discussing what I had found. I just decided to leave. At that moment, I realized that every choice in life has its consequences. I didn't want to be a victim of anyone's manipulation or another dramatic breakup. When I left, I was relieved. Not because of Linda, but because I had made a choice for myself that, although difficult, turned out to be necessary. I was no longer fighting other people's emotions or my own. I was choosing my freedom. Since then, I no longer let betrayal control my life. I stopped being afraid of what others might do to me. I chose peace and the ability to move on, leaving behind everything that does not serve me. And now, with each new day, I realize more and more that true strength is not in holding on to people or past experiences, but in having the courage to move forward, even if the path seems unknown. I am no longer looking for answers in the past. My future is my decision, and I am ready to go wherever my heart finds peace. I continued on my way, leaving everything behind. It was hard at first. It seems that every step forward was clouded by the shadow of past relationships and the memories that came back every time I tried to believe in someone new. But over time, I realized that living in fear of betrayal is another form of slavery. And I was no longer ready to be someone's victim, even if that victim was myself. I started to do something I hadn't done for a long time: self-discovery. I trained, got involved in some hobbies, and even decided to return to old hobbies that used to bring me joy. Painting, reading, traveling. These were the moments when I really felt like I was living, not just existing. Step by step, I began to restore my inner balance. Gradually, I began to feel that I was not alone in this world, that there were people with whom I could create healthy and real relationships. No illusions, no fears, no dramas. I wasn't looking for an ideal. I just wanted to find someone who would be willing to share this path with me on an equal footing, with respect and understanding. I never met Linda again, although I came across her messages from time to time. She tried to write to remind me of herself, but I decided that I didn't need to return to what I had already left behind. All these insignificant connections and attempts to keep me only distracted me from the real path. Shortly after that, I met Catherine. She was different, calm, confident, and with the same experience that had taught her not to rush into decisions. We talked for a long time, sharing our views on life and relationships. And there was not a single hint of manipulation or a desire to create some kind of perfect picture. We just enjoyed our time together. It was not a big or dramatic love story. It was a simple reality of two people meeting and finding support and understanding in each other. And it was much more important than any betrayal or mistake in the past. I no longer asked myself questions about what could have been or what would happen next. Now I knew that every day was an opportunity to create something new, without constantly looking back at the past. Now my decisions are based on inner peace, not on fear or hope. And one day, when I looked at my life again, I realized that I was no longer trying to avoid betrayal or mistakes. I was just living, and that was the greatest achievement. This path was not easy, but it turned out to be what I really wanted: true freedom, where there is no place for past pains and fears. And at that moment I realized that life really does give us a second chance when we are ready to accept it. I continued to live my life without looking at the past, and although my relationship with Catherine grew deeper, I remained cautious. She was wise, and we realized that each of us had come a long way. We didn't need to look for an ideal in each other because we were real people with all our flaws. However, with each new day, our life together became stronger, and I realized that this was perhaps the very stability I had never dreamed of. But then, a few months later, I received an unexpected message. It was Linda. She wrote that she wanted to talk, that there were some things she could no longer keep to herself. I was ready to brush it off, thinking that she wanted to manipulate me like she had done before. But for some reason, I decided to respond. We agreed to meet at a cafe where she and I used to frequent when things were still good. As before, she looked carefree, but I noticed that there was something else in her eyes: sadness, remorse, disappointment. She started a conversation without referring to the past, but I felt that something in her words did not match reality. "I made a mistake," she said, bowing her head. "And I'm really sorry. I thought I could control everything, that I could fix everything, and in the end I just ruined everything." I listened attentively, even though I was in a storm of emotions. In the past, I would have dismissed her explanation immediately, but now that I was different, I felt that there was a part of me that wanted to understand why she had done this. Linda told us how her relationship with her former colleague became more and more intimate, how she couldn't stop, and how it ultimately became destructive not only for us but for her as well. She honestly said that after we broke up, she was very sorry for everything that happened and realized that her search for perfection was empty. I didn't know what to say. Did I have the right to forgive her? Was it just a temporary repentance to ease her soul? Did she really feel the consequences of her actions? I realized that I was not looking for forgiveness from her. I had let her go from my life a long time ago, and although a part of me still felt pain and anger, I realized that the most important thing was my present life, my relationship with Catherine, and my plans for the future. When I left the cafe, I felt that this conversation was more for Linda than for me. She needed to clear her conscience, and I needed to just end this chapter of my life. I returned home to Catherine, and although it was hard for me to let go of everything that had happened, I felt that I was no longer tied to the past. I wasn't looking for answers to questions that no longer mattered. I was just living. You never know what lessons life will bring, but now I understood one thing for sure. True power lies not in changing other people, but in changing yourself. And in this I found my freedom. That evening, after the conversation with Linda, I had mixed feelings, but I didn't let them take over. I returned home to find Catherine in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her hands moving quickly and her eyes reflecting a calm confidence. She probably didn't know what I had talked to Linda about, and I decided it was best to leave it at that. I didn't want to bring any more turmoil into our lives, because we had finally found the balance and peace we had been searching for. "How was your day?" Catherine asked, turning her head to me with a smile. I replied that everything was fine, trying to maintain an outwardly calm demeanor, although Linda's words were still echoing in me. We sat down at the table, and the conversation turned to everyday things. Weekend plans, work, the weather. Everything was so normal, so stable. I realized that this was what I had been looking for all my life: peace, harmony, and the absence of worry. But the question remained inside me whether I could really leave everything behind. Linda had been with me through so much, but in the end I realized that her part in my life was over. Now my heart belonged to another person, and I couldn't turn back. A few weeks passed, and I didn't receive any more messages from Linda. She didn't try to restore what had happened between us. She went on with her life, and I went on with mine. But deep down, I felt that her presence was still clouding my thoughts. I couldn't be completely free of her shadow, even if everything looked perfect on the surface. Catherine noticed this. She was quite perceptive, and one evening when we were sitting on the couch watching an old movie, she just asked, "You still think about her, don't you?" I froze, surprised by her foresight, but there was no point in denying it. I nodded and she took my hand. "I know it's not easy. You've been through a lot, but I trust you, and I believe you'll make the right choice," Catherine said quietly, her voice warm and soothing. I looked at her and felt the heaviness in my soul that I had been carrying for so long. Catherine knew about my internal battles. She was more than just my partner. She was my rear, and, despite all my mistakes and problems with the past, I realized that I didn't want to drag it out anymore. I didn't want to live with the shadows of what was left behind anymore. At that moment, I realized that my future is not Linda, not my pain, and not the betrayal that touched our past. My future is now, and that was exactly what I wanted. Catherine and I have finally found the moment when we can be just people, without unnecessary illusions and resentment. I could have let Linda go. I could have been with Catherine and not needed anything else. What happened in the past was in the past, and I was ready to move forward. Since then, I have come to appreciate the moments we spent with Catherine more. We started traveling more, spending time together, without any worries or doubts. However, sometimes I still found myself thinking about Linda. It wasn't easy, and I knew I couldn't completely get rid of her image from my memory. But I learned to live with it. I learned to accept my past without letting it define my future. Catherine understood everything. She was patient and always supported me when I was struggling. She didn't compare herself to Linda and didn't demand that I change. She loved me for who I was, with all my flaws and mistakes. One evening, when we were sitting in our favorite cafe, Catherine suddenly looked at me with a serious expression on her face. I immediately realized that something was wrong. "There is something I want to talk about," she said slowly, as if she was struggling to find the words. I know you've been through a lot of betrayal, and I can see how you've changed after all this. I frowned, but didn't ask what she meant. I knew it would be important. I don't want to be your temporary comfort after all these painful relationships, she continued. I want us to build our future together, but without the shadows of the past. These words struck me. They made me wonder why I had held on to the past for so long, why I hadn't let go of everything that had happened and allowed myself to fully immerse myself in this new life I had in front of me. I bowed my head and took a deep breath. I understand, Catherine, I finally said. And you're right. I don't want to live in the past anymore. You deserve more than me being tied to my mistakes. You deserve my full attention and devotion. She smiled, and in her eyes I saw forgiveness, understanding, and hope. That night we agreed not to look back and not to let the past determine our future. It was a hard decision, but I knew it was the right one. Since then, I have learned not only to live with the past, but also to leave it behind, not to let it control my present. Every day my life became easier, and I could feel the changes in me strengthening my relationship with Catherine. We didn't talk about Linda anymore. The past was left behind where it belonged. And although I sometimes remembered those moments, I didn't let them change my reality. My reality was with Catherine, and that was all I needed. As time went on, I began to feel my life finally returning to normal. Catherine and I became not only partners, but also best friends. Our relationship was deep. We shared dreams, experiences, and even the small joys of everyday life. It seemed that everything we experienced was just a part of a bigger picture that led us to be together. But somewhere inside, I still carried what had happened to Linda. It wasn't painful, but moments of doubt and anxiety sometimes returned. I knew I could never completely forget what had happened, but I worked to keep it from affecting my present. And then one day, as I was sitting on the couch with Catherine, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Linda. At the first glance at her name, I felt the anxiety in my heart reappear. Catherine was sitting next to me and immediately noticed my reaction. "Who is this?" she asked calmly, but I could feel that she was waiting for an answer. I was silent. I couldn't answer. I didn't want to hide anything from Catherine, but I knew it could be hard for both of us. "This is Linda," I finally said, pursing my lips. A shadow of doubt appeared in her eyes, but she said nothing. She just looked at me, waiting for an explanation. "She wants to meet," I continued. "I don't know what she needs, but it's something important. I don't know why she decided to do this now." Catherine looked at me for a few seconds and then nodded. "You should go if it's important to you," she said, her voice calm, but I could tell it was not easy for her. "I don't know what exactly I want from this meeting. Maybe it's just an attempt to get answers, or maybe I just want to close this chapter for good," I admitted. Catherine nodded again, her eyes soft, but I could see she was worried. She understood that this was not just a matter of my relationship with Linda, but also how it would affect us, our future. "I trust you," she said. "If you feel you need to, you should do it. But remember that I will be there for you no matter what happens." I did not know what exactly I was looking for in this meeting, but I felt that it could give me what I needed to end this painful stage in my life. The next day I met Linda in a cafe. She was sitting at a table, looking as if time hadn't changed her. I didn't know what to expect, But when I sat down next to her, she started right away. I needed to see you. Not because I want to come back, but because there is something I have to tell you, she said, not taking her eyes off me. I listened to her, but I wasn't sure she could give me what I was looking for. She started talking about her life after we broke up, how she repented, how hard it was for her to start over. But just when I thought it would be just another attempt to get me back, she said something that turned everything around. I know that I hurt you, and I'm not asking for forgiveness for myself, but for what I did with your life. You were my love, and I realized that it wasn't real. I betrayed you because I thought I would find something better. But in the end, I lost everything. Those words were a revelation for me. I realized that my story with Linda was not about betrayal, but about two people who ultimately made a mistake in their choices. Her forgiveness didn't change anything, but it gave me peace of mind. I didn't need her to apologize or explain. I just needed to free myself from her shadow. When I got home, Catherine greeted me with a smile. I didn't tell her all the details of the meeting, but we didn't talk about Linda anymore. It was unnecessary. I had what I needed, the realization that I was no longer dependent on my past. My present was with Catherine, and I was ready to give her everything I had. As the days passed, I felt my life with Catherine gaining new momentum. We continued to build our story together, recovering what I had lost in the past. We discovered each other, experienced joys and difficulties together. But, as always, there are moments in life that can never be predicted. One evening, as Catherine and I were sitting at home talking about our plans for the future, I received a message. This time it wasn't from Linda, but from the very man I had once considered her friend. Someone who was part of all this chaos. Pete. The text was short, but it made me uncomfortable. Asterisk. We have to talk. You know what it's about. I'm sorry, but I can't keep quiet any longer. I heard Catherine sigh nervously when she saw my expression. She knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to let her into this dark part of my past. Immediately, I realized that Pete might have been holding on to some more of the secret, and now it was time to pay the price. Do you want to go? Catherine asked, her eyes turning sad for a moment as she sensed something important was on the horizon. I was silent for a moment and then nodded. Yes, I should have met him, I said. This is probably the last time. I finished everything with Linda, but it seems there's something else we haven't finished with him. She didn't ask me any more because she knew that if I decided to do it, it was the right thing to do. Catherine was strong, but I could see her worries. She didn't say it, but I could tell she was afraid of how it might affect us. And I was afraid too. When I met Pete, his appearance immediately reminded me that he and I were two different sides of the same coin, one light and one dark. He looked haggard, as if he was carrying a heavy guilt. You came, he said, his voice emotionless. I knew you would want to know the truth. I felt cold as I realized that what he was about to say could change everything I had tried to build with Catherine. You think I don't know why you're here? I asked. What do you want? I've already left everything behind. Pete smiled, but it was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of pity. He slowly pulled an old photo out of his pocket of the three of us. Linda, him and me, taken many years ago. You still don't get it, do you? He said, his voice cold, but I could feel the tension of fear in it. Linda didn't just betray you. You weren't the first. I was with her too. Neither of us knew what was really going on. We were tools in her game. I stood there in silence, digesting his words. I had long assumed that there were ulterior motives behind this situation, but now it was as clear as snow falling on a winter day. "What do you mean?" I asked, although I realized that we were only getting closer to the truth, which would be difficult. "She betrayed both of us, but most of all you," Pete continued. "She used your emotions, your trust. But she also manipulated me. I was her tool to make you believe that there was something between us. She wanted you to stay in the dark while she prepared her big plan. And now it all makes sense. She just wanted to manipulate us, to keep us under control. And then she left us both, and here we are." I felt everything inside me collapse. I couldn't believe that everything was so complicated. All these years, all this pain, they were just part of her plan, which I couldn't understand. My trust had been violated not only by her, but by Pete as well. And now I was standing in front of them, not knowing what to do. Pete saw my face and was silent. He knew that nothing could be fixed, that we were both victims of this situation. I returned home late at night, and when I opened the door, Catherine was already sitting in the darkness, waiting for me. Her eyes were calm, but I could see a deep understanding in them. "You know the truth," she said, without asking questions, just stating the fact. I did not answer. No explanation was needed because everything had already been said. Catherine simply put her hand on mine, and we sat in silence until dawn began to bloom outside the window. I finally realized that after everything that happened, there was no room for betrayal, no room for the past. Now my life is a new path, and this path was with Catherine. As the dawn bloomed outside the window and the room was filled with soft light, I felt most of my shadow begin to recede. I looked at Catherine, and her gaze, full of calm and support, was so tangible that it felt as if we had been in this moment together for ages. But the weight of the truth was still there, and I realized that I still had an internal battle to fight. "I know you understand," Catherine said, her voice soft but strong. "I saw your face change when you came home. You can't just leave this behind, and I'm not going to ask you to either. But you have to make a decision." Her words, although not a question, still felt like a challenge. She gave me the space to choose, and I knew I couldn't just let it go. Pete had spoken the truth, and everything I had held in my heart until then now seemed like an illusion. And here I was at a crossroads, not knowing which road to take. I got up and walked to the window. The light was coming into the room, and each ray seemed to reach out to me, like a call to new beginnings. I looked at Catherine and spoke softly. "I don't want any more illusions. I want to see who we really are. If we stay together, it will not be because of memories or ideals, but because of what we can build now." Catherine did not say a word. She just came up to me and hugged me. It was without words, without promises, but we both knew it was a step forward. Yet, even as I tried to find my way to the new reality, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was still unresolved. Linda and Pete were just parts of a bigger story. I couldn't forget what they were hiding, and I realized that their truth left me with even more questions. But this time I did not back down. My decision was to move on, but not through forgetting. I respected the truth even if it was painful. I did not let it destroy me, but I was not going to lose my dignity either. I looked at Catherine, and we both knew that we still had a lot of work to do. But this was our job, our path, and I was ready to walk it with her. We didn't have an exact goal, but it didn't matter now. We were starting from scratch, not looking back, and we were ready to face the future together, whatever it might bring. We sat there in silence, but it was more than just silence. It was an understanding that we had experienced something important and were now ready to move forward. The past could no longer hold us down, even if it had left marks on our hearts. The moment when the light filled the room again became a symbol of a new beginning. We could no longer deceive each other or ourselves. The real truth was in front of us, and although it was painful, it was the only thing that allowed us to move forward. I realized that nothing could be changed. Everything that had happened was in the past, but how we chose to move forward was up to us. I held Catherine's hand, her fingers intertwined with mine, and we looked at the light coming through the window together. We didn't know what the future held, but it didn't matter in the same way it used to. We could go forward together, and that was all I could really wish for. With words that were no longer spoken and a look that no longer needed confirmation, we left the room, leaving behind everything that had once torn us apart. We left the room, and although we walked in silence, I could feel the connection we had lost being born again. We didn't speak much, but every step, every movement was a language we understood. We became closer than ever before because we had gone through the darkest moments and realized that together we could overcome anything. Over time, we returned to normal life, but there was nothing that had once torn us apart. We began to appreciate the simple moments together more. Evening walks, laughing in the living room, talking over a cup of coffee, these became our usual rituals. We were no longer afraid to ask each other questions, because we felt that we no longer had to live in a lie. Our family gradually found harmony. It was a long journey, but I realized that this pain and betrayal became an integral part of our path to recovery. They could not break us, but, on the contrary, made us stronger. A few months passed, and one morning when I woke up and saw Catherine next to me, she was looking at me with a gentle smile. My soul felt a peace I had never experienced before. This relationship, against all odds, continued to grow and change. What we went through could not leave us the same people, but it made us who we are today. And even if this story of betrayal and loss was painful, it was necessary. It brought us here, until this moment when we stood together, both changed, both ready to move forward. We could not forget, but we could forgive. And in this forgiveness we found a new hope, a new path. Now, when we looked forward, we were not afraid. We knew that every day gave us a new chance to start over. And although our story did not end easily, with disappointments and pain, it ended as it should have, with a new beginning. Our lives returned to normal, but not in the same way as before. We now looked at each other not as two people who had been forced to endure great pain, but as two who had realized the true meaning of forgiveness and the strength to recover. It was a hard road, but now I realized that all these trials made us stronger. Catherine became more attentive to my feelings, and I tried to do the same for her. We realized that the simple moments that used to seem mundane had become valuable to us. Every breakfast together, every walk, every conversation became small celebrations of our new reality. Although we could not go back to the way we were before all this, we did not want to. We were different people now, more open and ready for change. Our love was not what it had been before, but it was real, new, and unpredictable. We realized that we still had a long way to go, but now we were ready. We might not have forgotten all our mistakes, but we had learned to live with them. They no longer determined our fate. We were no longer living in the shadow of the past, but building a new future. And so, with each new day, we found our way back to happiness, to being real for each other. The pain we had experienced was no longer something that held us back. It became a part of our story that led to this moment when we could look at each other again and feel that everything would be okay. It was a story that may have started with disappointment, betrayal, and pain, but in the end it turned into a new opportunity for both of us. We weren't ready for what happened, but now, looking back, we realized that it was necessary to become better for each other. And so we continued to live, not forgetting that everything can change in an instant, but also not letting the past determine our future. Our history was not perfect, and we knew it. There were moments when old wounds were reopened, when words could hurt more than we expected. But we were not the same as before. Now we were more careful, more mature, and wiser. Every step, every decision was the result of the lessons we had learned from each other and from what we had been through. I could see how Catherine began to change. She was no longer the same woman who had recently tried to hide her emotions and was afraid to speak openly about her feelings. Now she opened up to me like never before. She was no longer hiding her anxiety behind a mask of calmness, but was admitting her weaknesses, which made her even stronger in my eyes. We became partners in the full sense of the word. Our conversations became deeper. We discussed not only what was happening, but also how we want to live our lives, what is important to us, what we want to change in ourselves to be better people, better partners for each other. But there were also dark moments. Sometimes, when I saw her look at me, I felt again the pain she brought me and the anxiety that maybe everything would fall apart again. I tried not to fall into these thoughts, but sometimes it was hard. However, I knew that it is not how many times we fall that matters, but how we get back up. And we were getting up together, getting stronger every time. A few months passed and life began to feel more stable. We realized that there was a lot of good in our relationship, despite everything that had happened. It was something we were creating together, a new foundation on which we could build our future. And one evening, when we were sitting on the couch together, drinking wine and laughing, I looked at Catherine and realized that, despite everything, I didn't want to lose her. And even if our future is not what I had once imagined, I will be grateful that we were able to go through this journey together. We've been through a lot, I said, raising my glass. Yes, she replied, smiling slightly, and looking at me like she had never done before. But now we are here, and I'm ready to go anywhere with you. These were not words, but a promise, and I knew that we could overcome anything if we were together. Sometimes it feels like life is unfolding like a book, and you never know what page you're going to end up on. But with each passing day, I felt like Catherine and I were writing new chapters in our story. The difficulties we went through were not only a test, but also an opportunity to change our relationship for the better. It turned out that despite all the mistakes, our bond only got stronger. Sometimes, on those quiet evenings when we were sitting at home, just watching the fire burning in the fireplace, I would think about everything that had happened and couldn't believe how we had gotten to this point. She was my support, my backbone, and I was the same for her. We grew up together, survived everything that life threw at us, and it turned out that we could forgive like no one else. She came back to me, and I accepted her unconditionally. Only now I saw that her steps were not only an attempt to return, but also a change in her heart. And even with all those difficulties, I felt that our relationship had the potential to become something much better than it was before. However, despite how much we had changed, there was one thing that kept bothering me. I couldn't forget the moment I found out about her betrayal. Every time my mind went back to it, I was in pain, as if it had happened only yesterday. However, I tried not to dwell on the past, because I realized that if I kept it inside me, I would lose everything again. I respected her choice, and although it was not easy, I also respected my right to let go and move on. We continued to build our future together, bringing us closer to a new beginning every day. And although I realized that there is no true oblivion, and that some things will remain in our history forever, I was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. We were moving forward, and that was important. One day, as we were sitting on the steps of our house watching the sunset, Catherine turned to me, and her look was so sincere and calm that I felt that all the way we had come was worth it. "Thank you for staying," she said quietly, as if it were the most important thing she could say. I smiled and answered, "We'll get through this together, remember?" She nodded, and we hugged each other. And even if we didn't know what would happen next, one thing was clear. We were no longer just a couple. We had become a team capable of going through any difficulties, because we had one thing in common, one for the sake of the other. And that was the biggest victory I could have imagined. And every day we discovered each other more and more, as if we were beginning to teach each other how to live together again. Only now, after all the trials we had gone through, it seemed that everything that had happened before no longer mattered. All that mattered was now and what we were creating together. Those little moments when she laughed or I helped her with something became new memories that replaced the old painful ones. We were trying to build a new future, but sometimes old memories still came back. Once we got together with friends for a party. Many of the people we met still remembered our crisis and betrayal. I saw some of them watching us cautiously, doubting whether we were really capable of being together. They probably thought we wouldn't last, that it was all just an illusion that wouldn't last. But we were stronger than they thought. That night we realized again that we had survived all the storms, and our relationship had become a kind of achievement for us. Although I didn't want to live in the past anymore, I couldn't forget the time when everything seemed to be lost. I felt how difficult it was to forgive, but at the same time how important it was to do so. At the party we danced, laughed, and joked. Catherine and I were together, and it was no longer just a casual visit from old friends. It was something more. It was the moment when we felt that we could really be together, that we could survive anything, because there was something in our hearts that gave us the strength to go on. And so, when the night began to fall calmly, and we were returning home, Catherine spoke softly. "I still love you, even more than ever." I looked at her and felt such warmth, such a deep understanding that all the difficulties we had gone through were no longer valid. I said, "I love you too, and I know we can get through anything together." That evening we left the past behind. Betrayal, pain, and doubt. All of this became part of our history, which we were no longer afraid of, because we were stronger for it. We had a new chapter, a clean one, without all those old worries. I didn't know what was ahead of us, but with every step I felt that together we could do anything. Months passed, and our lives returned to normal. At first, we often recalled those difficult times, trying to understand what exactly led to the betrayal, why it happened. But each time these conversations became less frequent. We no longer discussed the details of the past. Instead, we started talking about the future we wanted to build together. Our relationship was changing. We became more open with each other, listening and understanding more. Catherine began to talk about her feelings often, and this was an important step for me. Now I realized that my willingness to forgive was not just an act of mercy, but also a chance to build something new. Those moments when we laughed together, when we helped each other, they became more important than anything we had experienced before. But there were also difficult moments. Just when it seemed like we were finally rebuilding our relationship, difficulties began to arise again. Those old doubts came back, and although we tried to ignore them, sometimes they still affected our conversations. My thoughts were ruled by distrust, and although I was no longer the same man who would immediately try to forgive, I began to feel that I was not letting go of things so easily. Catherine tried to be open, and I could see her fighting for our future. But sometimes she would get too closed off, and I couldn't understand why. It was like a silent sign that maybe not everything was resolved yet, that there was something undiscovered under the surface. And then one day, when I came home early from work, I saw an open letter on the table. It was a letter from her boss. I stopped, my heart beat faster. I don't know why, but I felt that something was wrong. The letter was calm, without emotion, like a normal official correspondence, but something in it seemed alien to me. I couldn't stop myself and started reading it, not knowing what exactly I was looking for in this letter. It said that Catherine would be promoted in the near future and also mentioned the need for additional working meetings. It seemed like nothing special, but why was my heart beating so fast? In the meantime, I heard the door open and Catherine walked into the room. She was tired, but still looked happy. She noticed the letter on the table and instantly made me feel her tension. "Did you read it?" she asked, her voice sounding calm, but I could see her eyes clouding over. "Yes," I answered without looking up. My fingers were cold, even though the room was warm. "Can I explain?" I heard her voice become calm again, but I felt that it was only an outward manifestation. She walked over to the table and quietly began to fold the letter. "These are just work-related questions," she replied, but I could hear something in her voice that sounded like fatigue, a tired truth. But this time I didn't stop. Something told me that I had to understand more. I asked, "Do you really expect me to believe that?" Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw fear in them. But she didn't answer. She just smiled and sat down next to me. We said nothing more. We sat quietly, each in our own thoughts. A few weeks passed, but that moment remained in my mind. I couldn't forget the look in Catherine's eyes when I asked her about the letter. It was more than just a work-related question. She was clearly hiding something. I couldn't understand why, but I felt that there was something behind it all that I hadn't seen before. Life went on, but I became more observant. I noticed little things that I hadn't paid attention to before. Her behavior was different. Sometimes she looked distant, like a person trying to hide something, but I couldn't figure out what. And even when we started spending more time together again, I didn't feel as comfortable as I used to. It was a new, unfamiliar tension between us. One evening when I returned home, Catherine was not alone. In the living room was a man I had never seen before. He was middle-aged, wearing a suit, with an expression that looked all too familiar. I had the feeling that I had seen this man before. "This is Tom, a colleague of mine from work," Catherine said as she stood up from the couch. Her voice was reassuring, but something in her eyes still worried me. "Hello?" I answered him, but there was no warmth or affection in my voice. I just wanted to understand why this man was here. Tom smiled, but I didn't notice anything sincere in his smile. He raised his hand to greet me. "Hi, I've heard a lot of good things about you from Catherine," he said, although his words seemed mechanical. I watched them communicate, and with each word I felt more and more tense. The feeling of uncertainty did not let go of me. This was not an ordinary meeting of a colleague. It was something more important. My intuition did not let me down. After a few minutes, Tom left and we were left alone in the living room. Catherine tried to make conversation, but I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts were on only one thing, Tom, and why I felt so anxious. "You didn't tell me he would be here," I said, looking her in the eye. "Why?" Catherine was silent for a moment, her eyes distant. She no longer seemed as open as before. Her speech was slow and careful. "This is just a working meeting, nothing more," she said, trying to smile again. But I already knew there was something more behind those words. "This isn't just a business meeting anymore, Catherine," I said, not looking away. My words were clear, and they were a blow she couldn't ignore. "What's really going on between you two?" She flinched, and it was enough for me to realize that my guess was correct. Her silence was the answer. We sat in silence, and I felt everything I had built falling apart in front of me. I didn't know what to do with these feelings. Anxiety, disappointment, anger, all of it mixed inside me. "It's not what you think," she finally said, but I could see her voice trembling. "What am I supposed to think, Catherine?" I replied, trying to contain my emotions. "This isn't just a chance meeting, is it?" She didn't answer, but I already knew. What we had experienced was no accident. And although she tried to explain it as part of her career, I knew it was much more than that. My betrayal was no longer just in her past, it was here, now. I didn't know what would happen next. All I had was my feelings, my intuition, which was giving me no rest. But what I had in my hands was now only part of a bigger picture. That night I could not sleep. There was no room for calm in my thoughts. The next morning I couldn't shake this feeling of heaviness. I woke up early, and instead of going back to my normal day, I started packing my things. I didn't know what to do next, but the realization that my suspicions were correct was heavy. I decided to talk to her again, this time not to listen to explanations, but just to hear the truth. Catherine was sitting in the kitchen drinking a cup of coffee. She looked tired, but I didn't look for sympathy. I already knew that we would no longer have the closeness we once had. All I could do now was to keep my dignity and make a choice for myself. "Catherine," I don't need any more excuses. I know there is something between you and Tom, and I don't want to be a part of that lie anymore, I said, looking her straight in the eye. She did not object. Her gaze only became even heavier, but this was not a surprise to me. She sat in silence, and I waited. I can't take it anymore, I added. I'm leaving. The few minutes of silence that followed my words seemed like an eternity. Catherine finally looked up and sighed. You're right, she said quietly, but her voice was full of despair. Tom, this has become more than I thought it would. I had no right. I realized that all this had long ago become not only a mistake, but also a bad choice for both of us. The conversation didn't bring healing, and I knew that it was impossible to bring back what had happened between us. That day I packed my last things and left. My hand no longer held hers, and I could feel the weight of the past finally starting to fall away. The decision was made, and although it hurt, I knew that now my life could begin anew. This chapter was closed. The next morning I couldn't shake this feeling of heaviness. I woke up early, and instead of going back to my normal day, I started packing my things. I didn't know what to do next, but the realization that my suspicions were correct was heavy. I decided to talk to her again, this time not to listen to explanations, but just to hear the truth. Catherine was sitting in the kitchen drinking a cup of coffee. She looked tired, but I didn't look for sympathy. I already knew that we would no longer have the closeness we once had. All I could do now was to keep my dignity and make a choice for myself. Catherine, I don't need any more excuses. I know there is something between you and Tom, and I don't want to be a part of that lie anymore, I said, looking her straight in the eye. She did not object. Her gaze only became even heavier, but this was not a surprise to me. She sat in silence, and I waited. I can't take it anymore, I added. I'm leaving. The few minutes of silence that followed my words seemed like an eternity. Catherine finally looked up and sighed. You're right, she said quietly, but her voice was full of despair. Tom, this has become more than I thought it would. I had no right. I realized that all this had long ago become not only a mistake, but also a bad choice for both of us. The conversation didn't bring healing, and I knew that it was impossible to bring back what had happened between us. That day I packed my last things and left. My hand no longer held hers, and I could feel the weight of the past finally starting to fall away. The decision was made, and although it hurt, I knew that now my life could begin anew. This chapter was closed.